Hi, today we're going to talk about Prohibition in America. And I know we've talked about this a little bit before when we were doing the unit on the late 1800s and early 1900s. We talked especially about the temperance movement and this push by many people in poor neighborhoods to ban the use of alcohol. It was believed that alcohol was a cause of a large amount of crime in America. Husbands would come home and beat their wives. They would drink. They would hire ladies of the night. They would do a number of negative acts in society as a result of drinking. And so a lot of people thought that the solution to the crime problem was simply to ban alcohol, which is a movement becomes known as the temperance movement or prohibition. And so, again, mostly the people who were supporting prohibition were people who lived in rural areas, people who had those traditional values that we had talked about. Usually a deep Christian faith, a deep belief in religion would push things. And again, the idea that people who have traditional values would believe that the use of alcohol, which was especially becoming popular in big cities, would have been a negative impact on society. And of course, these people believe that crime and poverty and abuse all are caused by the use of alcohol. If you want to know more about this, go back to the last unit that we did, and you can look up the stuff we did on the temperance movement there when we talk about the progressive era. So prohibition, we know, comes about with the 18th Amendment in 1919. We know that that makes the use, or well, not the use, but the sale, the manufacture, or the transportation of intoxicating liquors illegal. Basically, it was okay to drink alcohol if you already had it, but you couldn't make new stuff, you couldn't sell the stuff that you already had, and it was illegal to transport it anywhere. And so prohibition, for all intents and purposes' sake, banned the use of alcohol in America. However, the times, they are a-changin', as Bob Dylan's once said. And after World War I, remember, people are tired of war. They're tired of death. They're tired of destruction. The 1914 through 1918 period was a very depressing period in American history because so many people had died during the war, and even if people weren't dying, there was a lot of conserving, there was a lot of saving. And once World War I is over, people realize that they've missed out on a big part of their lives, and they just kind of want to go out and have fun. And part of that fun to some people is drinking alcohol. And so once the war is over, it's kind of ironic that we banned the use of alcohol right at about the same time that the war is over and people want to go out and have a good time and people want to have fun. So just because alcohol was illegal didn't mean that people stopped drinking. We know that the purpose of prohibition was to cause people to stop drinking, which would reduce the crime rate, which would make everyone happy. Thing is, people didn't stop drinking. They continued to drink, just this time they had to do it illegally. They had to do it secretively at a club, which were sometimes known as speakeasies. Speakeasies could be found sometimes in the basement of restaurants. Sometimes restaurants had a hidden room. Sometimes they were at private houses. But in any case, a speakeasy today, you would basically just call it either a bar or a nightclub. But back then, they were these secret places, and the name speakeasy comes from the fact that you would have to have a password in order to get in. And in most big cities and even in some rural places, speakeasies were pretty easy to find. They weren't all that secretive, and pretty much the cops left them alone. This also leads us to bootleggers. So speakeasies, they have alcohol, they're selling alcohol. But if you're wondering, well, where do they get the booze from? It's not that they have a huge stash built up from back in the day, although some places do. But they're also what are known as bootleggers, people who made their own alcohol. I think we looked at this photo before of an alcohol still that was found at the corner of Harvey Street and Church Street in downtown Plymouth, which is sort of by where Central Middle School is today. And so bootleggers were people who made their own illegal alcohol. They would have stills, or they'd make it in bathtubs, or they'd make it in other private places, and they would brew their own beer or distill their own liquor, and then they would sell it on the black market. The term bootleg comes from the fact that some people used to hide flasks in their bootleg, in the leg part of their boot, and it would be a way of sneaking alcohol around. So we've got bootleggers who are creating the alcohol. The other place where we get alcohol from is people who transport the alcohol. So you would oftentimes see bootleggers using a truck like this or a truck like this, where you've got hidden compartments where you can store an awful lot of alcohol. Bootlegging wasn't the only place to get alcohol. Prohibition didn't take effect in Canada, and so a lot of the liquor companies in America just simply moved across the border to Canada. Particularly in Windsor, Ontario, right across the border from Detroit, alcohol became quite popular. A distilling factory moved from the city of Detroit across the river and eventually became known as the Hiram Walker Company, which is still there today. It's one of the big buildings you can see on the riverfront, and they moved from Detroit to Windsor because of Prohibition. So alcohol is legal in Canada, and so what happened a lot of times is people would make this stuff in Canada, they would sneak it across the border, and they would bring it back into the United States and transfer it anywhere from here to Chicago and everywhere in between. Now, sometimes it was especially interesting that when the Detroit River froze over, people would either bring it by on sled, or sometimes they'd even try to drive cars across. You can see this Model T didn't fare so well, but a lot of people did. A lot of people were able to get their booze across the river because border control wasn't what it is today. Probably the most notorious people for transporting booze across the river was the Purple Gang. The Purple Gang was a gang in Detroit, and their goal was to bootleg alcohol and transport alcohol from Canada all across the United States. The Purple Gang worked closely with the notorious gangster Al Capone, and so if we look at Al Capone, the Purple Gang would work carefully with our man Al Capone. Al Capone was a mob boss. He was the head of the mafia in parts of Chicago, and his empire became so big that he was making about $60 million a year at the time bootlegging liquor. Certainly he was into other crimes as well, but bootlegging liquor was mainly how Al Capone made his money. And so he would hire people like the Purple Gang to supply him with a supply of alcohol, and then that would be sold throughout the Chicago area, and he made a ton of money. Now, we know that the Constitution made alcohol illegal, but we actually had to have something to enforce that law. And that's where the Volstead Act comes into play in 1919. The Volstead Act created what was known as the Prohibition Bureau, which was part of the Department of the Treasury. Why the Treasury? I'm not really sure, but I can just tell you that's what they did. And so it was the job of the Treasury Department to go after people who were bootlegging alcohol or smuggling alcohol into the country. Unfortunately, the Prohibition Bureau is short-staffed. They don't have enough money. They don't have enough people working for them. But they do have one thing going for them, and that is a guy named Eliot Ness. Eliot Ness gets put in charge of the Prohibition Department of the Department of the Treasury. And again, he didn't have enough funds to really carry out all the searches and seizures and try to prevent alcohol the way he needed to. He was seriously lacking in the funds and the manpower. But he did his best despite that. Eliot Ness was, at least in theory, and at least if you believe some of the books, he was an honest man. Al Capone at many points in time tried to bribe him, and yet he was unsuccessful. Eliot Ness refused to take bribes from Al Capone. Now, there are some recent findings that said maybe Eliot Ness wasn't quite as honest as he claimed to be. There are even rumors that he may have been an alcoholic himself, but at least as far as many accounts go, he was the head of the Prohibition Department, and he did his best to try to crack down on booze and to try to crack down on alcohol. So if you're in class right now, we're going to watch the movie The Untouchables. If you're not in class, you might want to save this and we're going to watch it in class. Feel free to stop right here if you don't want to spoil the rest of the story. We will watch these sections from the movie The Untouchables in class. If you were absent in class on the day that we watched The Untouchables, you can go ahead. You can probably find this on Netflix. It might be on YouTube, and you can definitely get it at the public library. That's where I get my copy from. So without further ado, we'll watch The Untouchables. And then if you want to continue with the questions, you can. Or if you want to continue before we watch the video, that's cool too. But I don't want to spoil the surprise for you. Alright, so that brings us to Al Capone. As you saw in the video, one of the things that Eliot Ness was trying to do was track down on Al Capone, but he was never able to prove that Capone was actually responsible for any crime, not the murder, not the kidnappings, and not the transportation of alcohol, not the selling of alcohol. Eliot Ness could never prove that Al Capone did any of that. What the Treasury Department was able to do was they were able to prove that Al Capone wasn't paying taxes on a lot of the money he made, and he was eventually found guilty and sent to jail for tax evasion. Pretty ironic that one of the biggest, baddest criminals in the world goes away for not paying his taxes. But Capone is found guilty, and he is sent to prison. One of the things that Prohibition was meant to do was to reduce the crime rate, but as you can see in the graph right here, it did just the opposite. The crime rate actually went up for the most part during Prohibition. It went up for two reasons. Number one, because alcohol was now a crime and people continued to drink, that meant that more people were committing crimes than before. But even if you were to exclude the drinking or sales of alcohol from the crime rate statistics, if we were just to look at violent crimes, things like rape, murder, assault, and battery, we would see that the crime rate went up during Prohibition. That's because people didn't stop drinking. You just created a black market for people like Al Capone to sell. You created a black market for people like Al Capone to sell his alcohol. And as a result, the violent crime rate goes up in America. And so by the end of the 1920s and into the early 30s, people are starting to say, this is crazy. We just want to have fun. We want to enjoy the fact that World War I is over. And now the crime rate's actually gone up, and the whole point of Prohibition was to bring the crime rate down. So people will call for an end of Prohibition. People will start to push for the repeal or doing away with Prohibition, and eventually the people will get what they want. Eventually pressure on the government gets so strong the government decides for the first time and the only time in the history of the Constitution that they will repeal Prohibition. They will take back the 18th Amendment by passing the 21st Amendment in 1933. So in 1933, the use of alcohol becomes legal again. So we want to look at some of the causes of Prohibition and some of the effects of Prohibition. These are all things that we've already gone over. Feel free to go back and check them out in your notes. But just one last note on Eliot Ness. He is one of the famous criminal busters in the world. And so if you go on the close-up trip to Washington, D.C., you could go to the Museum of Crime and Punishment, and they've got an entire exhibit on Eliot Ness, including some of the Tommy guns he used in busting Al Capone. And on top of that, you can find out a little bit more about him. I think this is interesting that not only were there books written about him, but there was a Bugs Bunny cartoon that was done against him, and you can check that out on your own time. You can probably find it on YouTube. Well, with that said, that's all I've got for you today. I hope you enjoyed today's lesson on Prohibition, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Take care.